Can't Red Bull just admit that they don't want Yuki Tsunoda, and yet they do want him? It's getting really confusing right now, isn't it?
And yet at the same time, it's clear that he is in very high demand, so which one is it?
One of the stories of the season is seemingly the maturation of the little driver that could, after years of struggling to hold on to his temper, and his definition in the sport being tied to his Honda connections. Because, let's be real, had it not been for the association with Honda back in 2022, then we probably might have seen Yuki Tsunoda depart Formula One. He would have fallen into the unfortunately extensive catalogue of Japanese drivers that just couldn't quite cut the mustard, and would have been yet another example of Honda really pushing its weight around in trying to manipulate driver lineups.
Need I remind you about Satoru Nakajima back in the 80s? Do you really think that Lotus would have hired him had Honda not been around?
Had Red Bull had their way, the 2023 lineup would have been Liam Lawson and Nick de Vries, and we would have had a completely different reality. But I was happy to see the beginnings of the rise of Yuki Tsunoda earlier in the year after the Japanese Grand Prix, where his more experienced teammate was having a mardy of a time, having yet to score, but now has at least made the gap look, less depressing. I'm also happy to inform you that that uptick in performance that we saw post-Suzuka has only continued. It's manifested itself into having Yuki Tsunoda being in the top 10 in the driver's standings, and nobody expected Racing Bulls to be toe-to-toe almost with Aston Martin at the beginning of the year, right? And even though the Canadian Grand Prix was unfortunate and it caused Yuki to fall out of the points and nearly take out Nico Hülkenberg for the second time in as many races, Yuki was the first of the two RB drivers to secure their place for 2025, and everyone thinking that it was going to take a very long time for that team to confirm who was going to be in their driver lineup, but at the same time it wasn't going to be at the top table like they had predicted.
Well, that's yet another prediction down the drain for this F1 content creator.
Instead, Yuki is being asked to lead the second team for another year and going into his 5th season of F1. Whilst on the surface this seems to be a blessing, that the team and Red Bull is seemingly happy with Yuki's performance, this revelation of Yuki getting the seat and denying Liam Lawson 50% of his opportunity for next year is only compounding the notion that, for yet another year, the Red Bull Junior operation is pretty much dead in the water, especially since recently another Red Bull Junior failed to cut the mustard and was dropped after 7 months and really got steamy over social media. At this point, being part of a driver academy is next to useless. You're not going to get into F1. What makes me extremely confused is that the Red Bull group isn't quite sure what to do with Yuki Tsunoda, and because of this, he seemingly has no choice in where his future lies. Like I said earlier, Yuki's association with the Formula Dream campaign and the Honda Racing School really helped him out in giving him proper time in which to bed himself in. And 2021 at first looked really solid for him. He was quite a character. He was quite fiery over the radio. He was a very fascinating personality right at the beginning of the time of Formula One where social media was becoming increasingly important, Yuki these days being very popular with the teenage crowd, something that Red Bull has noted. And that first season was a very interesting year where we saw Yuki fly as high as 4th place in Abu Dhabi 21, which got completely overlooked. Can you name me who was on the podium alongside Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton at that race without looking it up or Googling it? Yeah, it's probably going to take you a few seconds to try and remember who it was. It was Carlos Sainz, by the way. And I can also recall that Yuki in 2022 was starting to lose his groove. His trademark temper tantrums were getting quite stale, and he was being told all across the grid to get his emotions under control, and him being perilously close to a race ban thanks to penalty points.
But I don't think you need worry about a race ban because it's becoming quite clear at this point that the FIA is playing chicken, that they are not brave enough to actually give out a race ban. Kevin Magnussen at this point, the only way he's going to get a race ban if he completely shaves off Chase Carey's magnificent moustache.
As far as I'm concerned, Red Bull is quite happy with Yuki Tsunoda where he is, just keeping him there and not doing anything else. Had this been a couple of years ago, this wouldn't really mattered so much, but now, at the most volatile point of the F1 driver market's history in recent years, having your wings clipped and being kept at a team where you're not quite sure where it's going to go is an incredibly dicey situation. All the other drivers across the market are either trying to find a place where they might come good in 2026 or just trying to survive. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation for Yuki, isn't it? It does mean that Yuki has a seat for next year at a team which has got things going for it. I mean, even Yuki admits that he would be quite sad to see Racing Bulls continue to improve without him being there. But then on the other side of the same coin, another team might have yielded something spectacular, without the spectre of Christian Horner deeming your time with the team no longer useful or useful, like in the case of Carlos Sainz. In some shape or form, Christian is trying to find something useful in which to attach Yuki to. Now, I really have to bring the foam of doubt into this one because I'm really just formulating this in my mind, but maybe Yuki could be part of some sort of exit strategy, a velocity movement for Honda departing Red Bull. Maybe as a way of saying, thanks for the memories, here, why don't you take Yuki over to Aston Martin and give them a good driver in which to back up their ambitions for a constructors title? Because Honda really wants that with Aston Martin for the first year, and Lance Stroll is there. Although Dr. Marco has started making headlines regarding Lance Stroll's commitment in F1, so I mean, you never know. What made my head really spin and formulated the basis for this video are other comments that Helmut Marko made in regards to Yuki's contract, and saying that he was quite the popular candidate for an F1 drive, as said here. Ahem. Daniel had to beat Yuki at Racing Bulls. This year, that is not the case. Rather, it is the opposite that occurs. Yuki has changed a lot since his arrival in F1. He has really improved in his development. He is an emotional driver and he manages to limit his mistakes. He was in demand by other teams. He is young and he fits our mold. That's why we've just extended his contract for another year. In demand, eh? Well, Helmut, that's good to know.
And you know what? I don't think this is hyperbole on the Doctor's part. I think there's some truth in that.
I've heard so many rumours and theories as to where Yuki could go, and almost all of them made a fair lick of sense. But I think the one that really made me cringe in a way, and it just made absolutely no sense, was the idea of Tsunoda going to Alpine. Really? Alpine? Okay, a theorist, I get it. Having Yuki and Pierre back together at the same team, it's really, really sweet. It would look good for social media. But in terms of practicality, it would not work for Alpine. It just does not make any sense. Besides, they're already on their own charm offensive, as we've seen during Le Mans, with shots of Pierre with Bruno Faman in the Alpine garage right before both of their cars exploded after just about 5 or 6 hours, and then there were pictures of Pierre and Mick talking to each other, and then of course they did a selfie together, and that really stoked the fires as to a potential lineup for 2025. Maybe Pierre getting to know Mick and getting acquainted or something like that. It could be a red herring. Jack Doohan could be at odds because Bruno Faman's being a bit cagey as to who might be the next teammate, but it might be clear that Pierre's staying there. And while Pierre could put in a good word for his old AlphaTauri teammate, the logical part of my brain makes me think that Tsunoda is better off elsewhere. One thing was for sure though, and Yuki did admit this earlier on in the year, he was very much in demand and he was certainly looking at other proposals from different teams and liking the idea of being of interest from other teams. And most notably, one of those teams really looking for his services was the Sauber Audi project, with him being one of their backup drivers in case Carlos Sainz doesn't go there, which is looking likely to be the case. The latest rumours surrounding Carlos being that he's penning a 4-year deal with Williams, and that is a really big long-term deal. Any driver would be glad to have a 4-year deal, and what's making it really interesting and likely is that there is an exit clause after just 2 of them. The rumours stating that if the dream of Williams doesn't work out and they don't progress in 2026, Carlos can bail without any penalty. Again, this is speculation, rumour, conjecture, but it does make a fair lick of sense. It's kind of sensical, and it does play out with the idea of James Vowles being really, really affectionate towards Carlos, gushing about him at every opportunity, Carlos being very coy and cagey and defensive about Williams, which implies that, yeah, it's probably going to happen. It's just a question of when they're going to announce it. So with their star driver going, and Bottas clutching to that seat for dear life, saying it's still an option for next year, the Swiss publication Blick's now well-known list of 4 options is starting to look a little less likely, with Gasly looking to remain at Alpine, Ocon probably going to Haas or out of F1 entirely, and then there's Felipe Drugovich. Ooh, well, maybe. And with Yuki Tsunoda now being tied down to Racing Bulls, him being one of those 4 drivers that Audi was seriously looking at, maybe, hopefully, they might act upon it, and we might see Felipe Drugovich next to Nico Hülkenberg. They used to work at Aston Martin at one point, and now finally, we might see a Brazilian on the grid for the first time in nearly a decade. F1 without a Brazilian driver, it's criminal. It's absolutely criminal. I mean, we do have Bortoleto, and we have Rafael Camara in Formula Regional, which is looking absolutely devastatingly good. So the future's bright. We just need a slot in there. Come on, Formula One, come on! With Tsunoda on that Audi list and his rise to leadership at Racing Bulls this year, Marko saw to it that Audi didn't grab the driver that still has his uses. And I would imagine that this was probably likely the case because Marko was quite privy to what was going on at Audi because they were trying to poach Carlos Sainz. Of course, Red Bull talked to Carlos Sainz because Marko was in charge of contract negotiations. He was aware of how much Audi were going to pay Carlos, something that Red Bull couldn't match or wouldn't match. He probably would have blabbed it to other people because he did blab blab it out into the public that what they were talking about, Audi and all that stuff with Carlos. So I wouldn't be surprised that he was aware of what was going on with Yuki, because obviously transparency and all of that stuff, trying to match negotiations with Yuki to keep him there, exercising the option. And then, of course, Christian Horner waded in. He took over from Marco. He pretty much put an end to the Carlos negotiations and probably started the thing about exercising the option that Yuki had. As you can tell, it gets convoluted, but in the end, Yuki was pretty much denied the opportunity to go elsewhere. Red Bull are keeping him. What for right now, I'm not quite sure. Because Tsunoda himself admitted that there was a lot of interest attached to his name and did make the possibility of Aston Martin being a place he might try to reach for in the future, even though Honda has currently promised not to sway the direction of which drivers Aston Martin would pick. Especially since Lance Stroll says that he is still super committed to the project. Says he's super committed. Says.
And as for Alonso, oh boy, I mean, all the stuff that he's saying, it just doesn't sound like him. Saying that Lance Stroll will be the leader of the Aston Martin project when he retires, when he says finally bye-bye to Formula One. When that may be, I'm not exactly sure, but what is he consuming there? How much is Papa Stroll paying Fernando to say that stuff?
I mean, at least until he can be in a hypercar when he does choose to leave Formula One, and until Max Verstappen is able to take part in endurance racing himself. Speaking of... Now, I know, this next bit may be a bit of a joke, it may have been a bit of banter from Max Verstappen, but what he did say in regards to who would be his ideal Le Mans partner, aside from Alonso obviously, potentially the third person in the car, right now, would be Yuki Tsunoda. Again, it's just a joke, it's a bit of banter, but the fact that Max Verstappen thinks about Yuki in that regard and does value him in some way does count for something in terms of a conversation. Because he views Yuki as a good teammate because he's small and light, since Max's current hesitance to trying out endurance racing isn't due to a risk of injury, but due to the current regulations punishing heavier drivers, since there are very skinny drivers who are 15 to 20 kilos lighter than him. It's the balance of performance effect. And having Yuki Tsunoda on board, considering how compact he is, and he is pretty good and Max knows him, would be a nice little advantage, and as Max would say, it would make him look even better. It would make him shine. And yes, this could easily turn on a dime in the next week, because back in Imola, he did call Tsunoda quite stupid in holding him up in terms of trying to desperately hold on to the lead because, you know, lapping and all that stuff. But you never know. It could be a nice little interesting theory, even though it might be seen as just a joke. It could be a joke, because Max Verstappen ultimately doesn't really care who his teammate is. It seems to be more his team that cares about who his teammate is, rather than Max himself. I know, it might seem like I'm clutching at straws, but I'm just trying to think. There has to be a reason as to why Red Bull is keeping Yuki, aside from just taking the option just because they can. There has to be a reason. And the only thing I can think of, maybe, is that Yuki Tsunoda, much like Liam Lawson to Daniel Ricciardo, is being viewed as some sort of stick for Sergio Perez, as in, if you don't perform, we've got Yuki right here, he could take your job if you're not careful. Whether or not they would actually act upon it remains to be seen, but you know, Checo, Yuki is there, and he's not afraid to try anything. I don't think you need me to tell you, but there are a lot of confused faces up and down the grid as to why Sergio Perez was kept on for 2 whole years, especially with the timing of the announcement and that disastrous Canadian Grand Prix when not even Horner could justify and come to Perez's defense. As I said before, I'm not downing on Checo. He and his team pulled a blinder of a move to make that work, mostly in their favour. And Christian Horner has now had to pedal back his enthusiasm for keeping Checo and just affirming what he said in his statement that, oh, we're just thinking of 2025's lineup. No, it's not a 2-year extension, it's a 1+1 deal. Horner clarifying tells you that had this not have happened and Checo had a good race, he would not have been saying that. He would have been saying, oh yeah, no, Checo, he's with us to 2026, as the original press release from Red Bull said. He's there to stay until 2026. There's a bit of confusion. I don't think anybody knows what Horner's plan is, and I don't think even he knows at this point. It's a bit of a guessing game. I just think it's mainly down to the fact that Checo's loyal, and Christian Horner needs loyal people around him. That's why Daniel's still there. But that could easily change that sentiment toward Checo should Ferrari and McLaren get their act together, and now Mercedes is knocking on the door as well, potentially headed toward a recovery, right off the back of Toto saying that they've managed to stem the flow of people leaving, and in fact are actually recruiting people at a much better rate than they have been over the past couple of years. And with that option on Checo being confirmed by Horner, and them potentially not exercising that option like they did for Yuki, Tsunoda being around for 2025 is starting to make a little bit more sense, but again, it's still a theory. Instead of Ricciardo being the chosen one to partner Verstappen after Perez, Yuki could be the one next in line. As I touched upon, Max doesn't really care who his teammate is so long as they don't get in his way and he can just race cars. And Horner is very keen to make sure that the next person to race against Max Verstappen is somebody that will get along and know his place and not be, as Horner would state, an alpha driver. That's why we've not seen other big names such as Fernando Alonso join the team. Right now, Tsunoda isn't an alpha driver, but he is gaining more confidence and he still has his uses to Christian as some kind of motivator for Checo, as Liam is for Daniel. From my point of view, this tactic of using a driver as a stick to try and motivate another driver to do better doesn't really strike me as being constructive. All it does is just antagonize the targeted driver. Well, hey, I guess Red Bull has some kind of plan in order. I don't really agree with it, but it's a plan. But maybe this might have been enough to keep Yuki on side, aside from the contractual option that they have on him, which completely snuffed out any chance of him going to another team and basically took an up-and-coming driver away from one of the most volatile markets in recent history. No biggie. Sure, it might turn out okay. Racing Bulls might be even better next year, and Yuki Tsunoda might get on the podium at the second team, and he might just go, you know what? I'm okay with this brand new team that's not looking at just recruiting brand new drivers from the Red Bull Junior team every couple of years. Hey, if I'm here for the next few years and doing well, I could be fine. I might not need to change. I might not need to find another place. But what if it doesn't work out? That next year is a false dawn, and that 2026, it all falls apart. The regulations more favour Mercedes-based teams, and when Red Bull falls off like they did in 2014 and 2015, Yuki Tsunoda is left without a drive, an opportunity to find another team, and then things look a little bit dicey. Christian Horner looks like he's in the firing line and vulnerable, and therefore needs to enact some changes, especially if Max Verstappen leaves. This could work out in Yuki's favour, but there are a lot of variables, what-ifs, speculation, hopefulness, wishful thinking. There are lots of things that could work out for Yuki, but it depends on a lot of other things happening, especially if Checo has an uptick in performance. But if he does have a 2025 where it's basically this year all over again, starts off great, then he has a slump around Miami, then Horner will be very much pressured in getting rid of Checo. And that, in a way, is unfortunate for Sergio, but at the same time, people are just really confused about what Christian's doing at this point. But I would have liked Yuki to be in charge of his own destiny, like his Bessie Pierre was, at the point where he realised he wasn't going to get back up to Red Bull. Helmut was preventing him, Christian was preventing him, despite the fact he was doing wonders at that team. We're now seeing the same thing play out at that team again with Yuki. Laurent Mekies and Peter Bayer, they're saying, oh, Yuki's doing great as our team leader. He's a very good boost of morale, as is Daniel. Really trying to G up the spirits because the name of that team is incredibly corporate and they need good things going for it because, as I said, both drivers are very popular with fans and that gives them some good grace when they are really lacking it in terms of a team identity. There are a lot of things that are critical for keeping Yuki there because otherwise there's nothing going for them. I do think Yuki has a purpose there, but it does mean that the choice of his destiny has been taken away from him because I'm not sure whether Honda will actually take him on board for Aston Martin. It really depends on what happens with Lance Stroll. And I do hope that something happens because Honda's ambitions may be curtailed by a very stubborn Papa Stroll. And if you get Honda and Aramco getting irritable at Papa Stroll and threatening to pull the plug after a year or two, and Yuki not being allowed to join him, and Alonso's still there, and Alonso Stroll, and Stroll doesn't kick on with this brand new constructor, could be possible. But right now, Yuki's stuck. He's effectively in a prison sentence. And whilst it might be okay in the short term, the long term, in him being Formula One, he may only have one more year left. He could be in a position where Carlos Sainz is right now. There is a strong possibility of Yuki Tsunoda being the most successful Japanese driver in F1 history. And that is a very tempting and tantalizing prospect, which might have fueled him staying there, but at the same time, it's unfortunate. Audi might have taken him. They might have turned out to be fantastic. And him being the team leader of a works operation that isn't Red Bull and hasn't got Christian Horner breathing down your neck, that sounds kind of cool. He might be in an effective prison sentence, but the prison is a low security operation with very nice furnishings, so it's not all that bad. I really do wish him the best for his future, as I wish the Formula Regional hopeful James Wharton the best for his future, as he's looking to try and get himself into FIA Formula 3. Something I touched upon in this interview here, which you can go and watch right now. I really like talking to future drivers. It really gives me a really good insight as to how these drivers are going to try and get into Formula 1, when right now it's really basically against them. Here's good luck, James.